Welcome to the Masculine Wilderness Podcast. I'm your host, Tom Perez, the CEO and founder of Epic Project, a nonprofit organization that is working to nurture a generation of generative men. Today, we have a very revered guest, someone who for decades has been making an enormous impact on the global fight against the exploitation of women and girls. Nicolas Kristof, columnist for the New York Times since 2001, is a two-time Pulitzer Prize winner who writes op-ed columns that appear twice a week in the New York Times. Nick grew up very modestly on a sheep and cherry farm near Yamhill, Oregon. He graduated Phi Beta Kappa from Harvard, then studied law at Oxford University on a Rhodes Scholarship, graduating with first-class honors. He later studied Arabic in Cairo and Chinese in Taipei. While working in France after high school, he caught the travel bug and began backpacking around Africa and Asia. Mr. Kristof has lived on 4 continents, reported on 6 of them, traveled to more than 160 countries. During his travels, he has had unpleasant, to say the least, experiences with malaria, mobs, and even a plane crash in Africa. In 1990, Nick and his wife, Cheryl Wu Dun, then also a Times journalist, won a Pulitzer Prize for their coverage of China's Tiananmen Square democracy movement. They were the first married couple to win a Pulitzer Prize for journalism. Nick won a second Pulitzer in 2006 for his work that focused attention on the genocide in Darfur. A documentary about him called Reporter was executive produced by Ben Affleck and aired on HBO. In today's episode, Nick and I talk at length about his new book, Chasing Hope, and his opinion piece titled The Children of Pornhub, which brought the internet porn giant to its knees and sparked a global outcry to hold the executives of Pornhub accountable for profiting from human trafficking and exploitation. We discuss his journalism and his lifetime commitment to ending violence against women and girls. This is truly an episode you're not going to want to miss. But please remember that this is a conversation that touches on sexual violence. And while it's never our goal to sensationalize the trauma of this topic, we strive to speak truthfully about the damage being done. So again, thank you for joining us today as we explore more of the masculine wilderness.
In today's episode, we would like to shine a light on our guest, Nicolas Kristof, and his recent memoir, Chasing Hope, A Reporter's Life. In this book, Nick Kristof takes us behind the scenes as he risks his life to shine a light on the world's most pressing problems and blaze a trail to a better future. In a time when trust in journalism is in jeopardy, his honesty, humility, and humanity are rays of hope. That is a quote from Adam Gant, the author of Hidden Potential. This candid memoir of vulnerability and courage, humility and purpose, mistakes and learning is a singular tale of the trials, tribulations, and hope to be found in a life dedicated to the pursuit of truth. Released in May of 2024, this book is now available for you at your favorite bookstore and online. You'll hear more about this book in the episode. We can't wait for you to hear.
Welcome, everyone, to another episode of The Masculine Wilderness. This is so special for me today. We have Nick Kristof, whose recent memoir came out, Chasing Hope. I'm so excited. I have not been able to, I'm in Montana, so I haven't been able to actually get that copy, but I've read a ton of the other stuff that you have done over the years. Man, your resume is dense and expansive, and just your story is absolutely fascinating. I've said it with a couple of our other guests, Nick. I'm a grassroots activist. I start at the local level. We started with Epic at the local level, and we're doing, what we can. And along the way, I've been just so fortunate to cross paths with people who are in the same work, but they've started from a more global perspective, and yours is certainly that, but it's also unique because you come at not just the issue of exploitation, but a whole bunch of other issues through the lens of a journalist. The first question that I want to pose to you is, you've seen at both the local and the global level how vulnerability, all kinds of different vulnerabilities, lead to exploitation. And can you give us a few examples, obviously including sex trafficking, but of how that vulnerability connects to exploitation? Yeah, just what are you seeing as a journalist related to vulnerability and exploitation?
Sure. Well, I'll tell you sort of how I got engaged in this. And So in the late 1980s and early 1990s, I was the New York Times correspondent, bureau chief in China, and I covered the Tiananmen Square crackdown, which was a massacre in June 1989. We don't know, but probably killed between 400 and 800 pro-democracy protesters, student protesters. And it was, I was in the crowd that the troops opened fire on. It was something that I will never forget. It was on the front page for weeks and weeks and weeks, and it seared me. Some months later, I came across figures about the number of girls in China who were essentially discriminated against to death because they didn't have equal access to food and health care. And then that would soon be compounded by sex selective abortion. And so there were 50 million women and girls missing in
Wow.
China and effectively discriminated against death. And I'd never written a peep about that. Nobody had ever talked about that. And I thought, the 400 to 800 people massacred at Tiananmen, that was an important story that deserved all that coverage. But I thought if we're going to cover that, we also need to cover this other, huge story. And so then that was the beginning of what got me thinking about some of these gender inequities. And then that led me to a village in Cambodia some years later that where young girls had been kidnapped and were being auctioned off for their virginity. And it was just hard to understand how this was possibly happening. The girls told me that if they ran away, the police would arrest them, hand them right back to the brothel owners. And they were terrified. And this felt exactly like what 19th century slavery might have been, except these girls are already dead of AIDS by their early 20s.
Discriminated against to death.
To death.
Is that, wow,
Yeah,
I've never heard that phrase.
There's obviously immense discrimination in the U.S. and we have Title IX and so on. But just one way of thinking about it is that when you ask people, they always think that there are more females than males in the world, because in the U.S. there are more females than males. In Europe there are more females than males. In a normal society, women live longer, and so there are more females. Actually, worldwide there are more males than females, because particularly in Asia, there are so many people who are discriminated against to death. Wow. And that's one measure of gender inequity worldwide. And it doesn't understate at all the challenges that women face in this country, which are very real. But it is a reminder that in much of the world, it's lethal.
Being born female is just an inherent vulnerability.
Yes, it is. And it is also very much class dependent. So, if you are, you're certainly much better off if your parents are educated and, but if you are at the bottom of the barrel in terms of socioeconomic status, in terms of education, then you have a lot less value in some societies and some cultures. I was once on the India-Nepal border. I was crossing from India into Nepal in a tiny little, village, and there was a Indian, the special police who was there, and he was delighted to see me, somebody who could speak English, and we chatted, and I asked, what he was doing there, and he said he was there because America was putting pressure on India to reduce the flow of pirated DVDs from Nepal into India. And I said, oh, that's great. And, what about all these trafficked girls who are crossing the border, just a stream of them headed for the brothels of Mumbai and Calcutta. And he said, oh, yeah, not much we can do about that. And it's too bad about them. But, the boys don't tend to get married until later. And this way, the boys get off their energy and they don't bother, good middle class Indian girls. And it was just,
wow.
It was a reflection of the attitude toward these young Nepali girls who were destined to be raped and in some cases get AIDS.
What year was this?
This, let me think, this would have been about 2007, 2008.
Okay. And then the Cambodia experience, was that around the same time?
That was earlier. That was about 1997.
Okay.
That first Cambodia trip I did, what I thought was going to be one trip around Asia to report on young girls being trafficked. And then that just haunted me to see these young girls. It's a different village, but I ran into two girls, a 14-year-old and a 15-year-old, who were locked up in their brothel. And the 15-year-old told me that she'd been kidnapped by a neighbor and sold to the brothel. And when she went missing, her mother traveled all around Cambodia to try to find her daughter, knowing that if your teenage daughter goes missing, she's probably in a brothel. And so just a week before I got there, the mother had walked into that red light district and into that brothel, and they'd had this joyous reunion. And so in my naivete, I said, well, so why are you still here? Why didn't your mother take you home? And she said, well, the brothel owner said she'd paid good money for me. The brothel owner was a woman, by the way. The brothel owner said she'd paid good money for me, and my mother would have to buy me back. And my mother didn't have the money.
Wow.
And, you just don't forget about that. And so then I began to travel, more around the world, reporting on this in India and Pakistan, in Malaysia, in Thailand. And then I began to think, well, what about the US? I mean, I don't think the US situation is as bad as it is in India or Cambodia, but it's pretty bad. And we don't have the moral authority to tell India or Cambodia what to do unless we make greater efforts to fix our own problems. And so then I began reporting on the problems in the US, and indeed, they're abysmal.
Your book, Half the Sky, came out in
2009.
2009. And it was, I remember, I started getting involved in this work right around then. So it was one of the, there didn't seem to be a lot of books at all during that period, but I'm curious. Yours was one of the most comprehensive ones. That's 2009. It's 2024. Has there been much change? Has there been much progress? What have you seen? I'm curious if you've gone back to any of those places that were, part of what made you write that book in the first place.
I think there's actually been significant progress. And I think the trafficking community, the anti-trafficking community, the activist community, sometimes hasn't been willing enough to acknowledge that backdrop of progress. And I think it should encourage us that, that activism does make a difference. And so that first village that I went to in Cambodia, Savai Pak, it is no longer openly peddling young girls. There still is some trafficking that goes on of girls, but much less. And there was one brothel that in Cambodia, elsewhere, where was it 2003 or 2004, I actually bought two girls from that brothel and took them back to their homes, paid $150 for one and a little more than $200 for another. And I got written receipts for buying a human being.
Oh my gosh.
But I went back to that brothel a number of times over the years. And in the end, because of American pressure, the police didn't close down the brothel. They didn't arrest the trafficker who was kidnapping girls. But what they did was they kept demanding more in bribes. And so it no longer was profitable for that brothel owner to run a brothel. So she closed her brothel, freed the girls, and turned it into a grocery store. And, this is unsatisfying in the sense that there's no justice. But boy, it's a lot better than her running around kidnapping girls and selling them. I have seen that measure of progress, especially in the kidnapping of very young girls. There was a study that International Justice Mission did in Calcutta, which is a place I've reported on trafficking quite a bit, and it found that a 60% reduction in the number of girls under 18 in brothels in Calcutta over about a 5 or 6 year period. So I think that there's still way too much trafficking. I do think that there are more girls getting educated, which creates a certain amount of immunity from trafficking, that the police for the first time pay some attention to the issue. And child marriage is likewise. There have been some inching steps, progress on that front, which is, sometimes just a horrendously awful situation where you get, guys in their 40s or 50s who are marrying 14-year-old girls. That's, I think, less common than it used to be. And in the US, there's likewise been still still way too much trafficking, but you know, pimps are at risk today in a way they were not 15 years ago.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
so let's put it that way.
Maybe it's less hospitable business climate than it was uh,
Yeah.
back in the day, so to speak.
Yeah. You have to be unlucky to get sent to prison if you're a pimp, but there are more pimps now who are unlucky, and
Yeah.
a prosecutor does actually go after them and
Yep.
does put them away. And so, I think there is some progress in that regard too.
One of the things I really admire about your work and really the way you approach the work, there's a thoughtfulness to it. But I've heard you talk about this idea of desired outcomes. When you talk about a really difficult, gnarly issue, cultural issue, you talk about desired outcomes, and it seems to put the focus not on like political wins or losses for one party or another, but more about asking, generally speaking, what kind of world do we want? And so I want to, in that spirit, want to just have you riff, if you will, a little bit on that, a variation of that question. What kind of men do we want to become? What kind of men, what kind of boys do we want to raise as men? How would you answer that question? Because so much of this is gendered violence.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So how would you answer that question? What's the masculine outcome you think would be helpful?
So, I think we want boys to, have empathy and to see girls and women as human beings and as people rather than as something to be exploited and taken advantage of. I think that we also have to recognize that boys and men in much of the industrialized world have really gone through the ringer in the last 20 years or so as factories have moved abroad, and that traditionally, especially in working class communities, men regarded themselves as the wage earner. They were the kind of the top of the heap, and brawn mattered more than anything. And men were pretty good in that age of brawn, and that age has largely collapsed. And that the upshot has been that, if you look at when Title IX was introduced to expand opportunities for girls in universities, there's an even greater gender gap in colleges today than there was then, but now it's the reverse. Now
Oh,
it's
wow.
many fewer young men in college and university, and boys are much more likely to drop out of high school. They're more likely to overdose. They're more likely to kill themselves. And I think that may be one reason why we're seeing a rise of kind of, I don't know what to call it, but misogyny among some young men in particular, kind of a backlash that I think kind of complicates this whole effort. They feel screwed over and they want to, they're angry at the world and at women.
Yeah. Yeah. How is there any difference that you've experienced between how that plays out for men in rural versus urban settings?
I think that it's really more class-based than geographic, but to the extent that rural areas have done particularly poorly over the last 20 years, I think that, a lot of America has been left behind. My hometown here is an example. A third of the kids on my old school bus at this point have died from drugs, alcohol, and suicide. And that wasn't because my generation was less smart, less diligent, less good than previous generations. It was largely about good jobs moving away.
Yeah.
And then meth arrived, and boys in particular self-medicated. They got criminal records. They became even less employable. Then they became less marriageable. And so the family structure tended to fall apart for a lot of these folks. And then you had kids being raised in, kind of chaotic situations, often by parents who were wrestling with addictions. And these kind of problems were transmitted to the next generation. And it's been, I mean, I think it's a huge national problem, and it affects the Black community, the white community, the Latino community. But it's focused on kind of low folks with less education and thus less ability to compete in in a 21st century economy. And I think they feel angry at elites for failing to address their problems. And, they're not wrong. I mean, American policy and European policy, for that matter, has not been very sympathetic to those who've been left behind economically.
I mean, I'm hearing you describe that scenario, and I can see that playing out in a rural, suburban, or urban setting with just working class people. And I know it must be, I think it would be agonizing having grown up with that masculine framework like you talked about. And then it's like all of a sudden somebody moved the goalposts.
Yep.
And that's got to feel very disconcerting. I'm sure there's a better word for that, but
yeah. And then meth arrives and people self-medicate and, they find their pain, and that makes it worse.
And then a whole bunch of consequences from that. And it goes. Do you see any really workable solutions for that trend, especially with respect to men? Like
So, I mean, education, I think, is the best solution to almost every problem. And, we have a robust conversation in America about how to improve college access, but we don't really talk about the fact that 1 in 7 American kids still doesn't graduate from high school. If you don't graduate from high school in 2024, you're cooked. And that is disproportionately a problem of boys. It's a problem of, boys in particular. They don't learn to read by 3rd grade. If you don't learn to read by the end of 3rd grade, you're just, it's an uphill struggle thereafter. You're less likely to graduate from high school. There's a lot of, I mean, I don't think there's no silver bullet, but in a sense, there's silver buckshot. There are a lot of things that help. Good rural metaphor there.
I like that. It works.
One project that I've been involved in and bringing it to Oregon and supporting it is a program that gets glasses in the hands of kids in lower grades who can't see the blackboard. And, if it's a middle class or affluent kid who needs glasses, they will get them. And if they break their glasses, they'll get a replacement pair. But in an awful lot of households, those kids never get that vision screening. Or if somehow they get it, then they lose their glasses, or they think they're nerds if they wear glasses. And one way of thinking about it is that a slight majority of boys in juvenile detention in 10th grade need glasses. And that's because basically they needed them when they were in 2nd grade, but because they didn't get those glasses, they were fidgeting, they were causing problems, they didn't learn to read, and that graduated into being juvenile offenders. And so finally in 10th grade, they get glasses from the juvenile detention center, but at that point it's kind of too late. And, if we can get glasses in the hands of kids in early grades, it's an incredibly cheap intervention that really matters. I think that having more male teachers probably helps too, providing, role models. I think anything we can do to keep families together so boys have good role models at home or in the community. There's some good evidence that helps boys in particular.
It's fascinating that something as simple as a pair of glasses could change the trajectory of a young boy's life.
Absolutely. And it makes eminent sense because, I mean, if you or I had been in 2nd or 3rd grade and we couldn't exactly see the board or couldn't see what was going on, then of course we'd be pulling the pigtail of the girl in front of us and getting sent to the principal's office and then living up to the reputation of being a troublemaker that had been ascribed to us.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah. That's, is that kind of solution, like those simple things, are they widely known, or do you find yourself like with this work, are you having to say what feels like to you is an obvious solution, or do people is it so obvious that we don't even think about that as being something really doable to help young boys?
First of all, I think there is finally a growing appreciation of the boys, the degree to which the gender problem that we have we have a gender problem in the U.S. with girls suffering abuse and women suffering discrimination in some fields, et cetera. We also, at the same time, have a problem with boys lagging in school, boys being more likely to have contact with the criminal justice system, et cetera, et cetera. And I think that there's now a greater understanding that both can be true at the same time, that when you talk about gender issues, it's not just about girls, but also we have to think about boys. I think that in education, 20 years ago, you ask somebody about how to improve education outcomes, and they would give you a couple of anecdotes and they'd have a couple of ideas. Well, now we have evidence, and these things have been introduced in randomized control trials. So we know what interventions work, at what cost. Mississippi, of all states, managed to have dramatic improvements in third grade reading scores. I mean, unbelievable improvements.
Yeah.
And, Mississippi hasn't solved child poverty. They haven't solved racism, but they have gotten third grade kids to read, including boys. And if Mississippi can do it, that means no state has an excuse for failing to get kids to read and do math. I think we've learned a lot about what works. I think that our failure has been one of political will. And that's, an example where the U.S. is so polarized now, left, right, Democrat, Republican, but these are issues that aren't particularly political, that Democrats and Republicans alike want kids to be able to read. The states that have the best education outcomes are arguably Massachusetts and New Jersey, both Democratic states. Meanwhile, as I said, the states that has the greatest improvement in education outcomes is Mississippi, a very Republican state. Alabama has also done well in terms of improvements. Again, a Republican state. So, these aren't so much ideological issues. They're just practical issues of actually helping kids in need.
They needn't be ideological issues. We ought to be. Yeah, it seems like these things we can all agree on. I love the way you frame the gender problem, and it does affect both boys and girls. I'm curious because in your career, like you've spent your career, seems like shoulder to shoulder with your wife. Like you guys are both in this work together. How has that shaped your views on this thing? I love doing projects with my wife, but to kind of go to work every day in the same space. Like how does that work for you? Cause it clearly has worked. I mean, you and your wife both are so accomplished in your fields, but what have you learned from that?
So, I grew up surrounded by strong women. My grandmother was writing for national magazines way back in, I don't know, in the 1940s.
Wow.
And my mother got a PhD, graduated from University of Chicago at 18, got a PhD, really strong women. And so, of course, then I wanted to marry a strong woman, and I did in Cheryl. And I have seen firsthand the difference that it makes when there is a educated, empowered woman in the house, but also in the community, and the degree to which it, affects child rearing. It affects the economy of a family and of a community. And so that's one of the reasons I've been such a champion of girls' education. I think that's one of the great ways to change the world, to get women involved in business, in the economy, in society, in nonprofits, in government.
With such a strong partnership, with Cheryl by your side, you guys are in this together. How does it affect you when you see, and I know you've seen it in your career, a complete lack of that kind of equality and shared partners? Like, how does that hit you just personally? How does it, affect your wife? Because I would imagine, I think I'd say the same for me. Like, I know what it feels like when I'm shoulder to shoulder with someone I trust implicitly. And then when you see the complete lack of it in a community or in a family structure, how does that affect you?
You just think of the incredible lost potential, and it's not just the injustice to that girl or to that woman, and the degree to which, they are sometimes treated as doormats or subjected to violence. A bird cannot fly with one wing. And likewise, a society can't fly if it doesn't utilize half of its human resources, half of its talent. The greatest undeveloped resource any country has is, not its oil or coal or, timber here in Oregon. It's the female half of the population. I mean, along with a significant share of the male population, folks who don't get the education that they should be getting, or then the opportunities. It's not just, it's not a question of a college degree. It's a question of some way to utilize their brains, their capacity.
There's so much to unpack there in terms of just that. I have 3 daughters. And so, and they're grown. They're all in their 30s. You have 3 children?
2 sons and a daughter.
Yeah. Similar age? Are they all roughly in their 30s?
Yeah, they're all the oldest in early 30s, the youngest in late 20s.
Okay. So the like that question about what kind of world do we want to leave? What kind of, men and women do we want to become? I think about that at a very personal level with respect to my own children. And now when I started this work, I didn't have any, but now I have 3 grandchildren. And so it's a much more pressing question. Do you have grandchildren?
No grandkids.
Okay.
We're, if the kids are listening, hey, get to work.
Hey, I didn't plan that.
Yeah. But, I remember one time we were making a family trip to Cambodia. And so as a whole family, we visited this brothel I mentioned that I had gone to repeatedly in northern Cambodia. And, I remember thinking, it was more inappropriate to take my, I don't know, teenage boy into this brothel, or to take my,
on a family trip.
My young daughter. But but even more than that, just what struck me was, my daughter, smart, educated, able to form her future, and being surrounded by these other girls who had in many cases been, kidnapped and were going to be locked up in the brothel. My boys, I think, were, raised to not patronize places like that and to form loving, healthy relationships with their partners. And it's really sad to see the opposite in that forced brothel in Cambodia.
To be clear, you took your children on a family vacation to a brothel in Cambodia. That's the stuff of dad legend. I mean, who does that?
Our vacations are, I remember one Christmas day we were, maybe it was the same trip we were in Cambodia, and we went out to the garbage dump to, talk to scavengers, kids out on the garbage dump. And
Oh, wow.
one time I was, I'd taken my daughter out of school when she was about 10, and we were in Tegucigalpa, Honduras, going through this gang neighborhood, and a local priest was leading us through, and he had connections, but it was still, all these glue sniffing armed gang guys at each checkpoint, and
Wow.
it was hairy. And at one point, my daughter turned to me and she said, "Dad, when my neighbors go on vacation, they go to the Caribbean." So it was sort of a family joke that our next family vacation was indeed to the Caribbean. It was to Haiti during the cholera outbreak.
Oh my God!
So we dragged them through cholera hospitals.
You're going to take them to Disneyland one day, and they're going to just be so disappointed. Such a letdown. That's amazing. Well, I can't imagine that you came by this kind of sensitivity, like just accidentally. We have a little bit of overlap in our stories, very slight overlap, but like you, I was born in Chicago to an immigrant father. My dad was from Cuba. That's where the similarities end. But I'm curious, like how it sounds like heard you speak a couple times about just the relationship, the impact of your dad. How's your dad, your mom, both your
Yeah.
parents shaped this? Like, where does it come from? Just this deep thoughtfulness about the world.
So I thought about that when I was writing my memoir, Chasing Hope. And I think I was very shaped by my dad's experience. My dad was Armenian from Eastern Europe. The family had spied on the Nazis during World War II. They got caught. Some family members were executed by the Nazis. Others were executed by the Soviet communists. The family fled in every direction. My dad was in a concentration camp. His life was saved effectively by an intervention by a French diplomat who was really kind of breaking the rules. I mean, my dad wasn't French. The French diplomat should have been looking after French interests, not some random Romanian refugee like my dad. And yet this diplomat did that, and it worked. The diplomat never became an ambassador. And I think that may have been because he was prone to breaking the rules. And then my dad got to France, and then family in Portland, Oregon, sponsored his way to come to the U.S. As a refugee. But I've tried to pay that forward, and have periodically given my editors gray hairs by coming pretty close to the line about what is appropriate for a journalist to do to help others, and where the lines aren't clear. One thing I talk about in Chasing Hope is one time my wife and I helped a Chinese dissident escape from China after he had been in prison and fled prison. And, one pretty basic rule of being a foreign correspondent is you don't help escaped felons flee the country. But here's a 19-year-old guy who was in prison because he had helped us and helped New York Times readers. And if we didn't help him, he was going to get caught. And so we did help him. It was unprofessional, but something I'm very proud of.
Is your dad still around? Is he?
No, I'm afraid he passed away in 2010.
Okay.
A rich life at age 91.
Yeah. Wow. And so he was around to see the growth of your career and your marriage and family then. Yeah.
Absolutely. And, he provided a good model of aging. At 89, he broke his leg rolling the tractor. And I thought, when I'm 89, I want to be rolling the tractor too. Better than the alternative.
Was that at the family farm?
At the farm, yeah, here.
Yeah. Well, yeah, it beats, beats falling in the bathtub, I guess.
Exactly.
Right?
Exactly.
That's crazy. I love that. A couple more questions. I want to keep my eye on our time together, but shifting the focus just a little bit. But you recently, it's not so recently now, it feels like it, but you wrote an article on Pornhub and the children that were exploited, and there was an enormous amount of fallout from that, the exposure that you brought to that. What surprised you about the reaction, the fallout, the consequences of that story? And maybe if you can give us just a quick summary of the actual story.
I'd written a lot about trafficking over the years, and I knew that some of the girls that I'd written about had been, their pimps had posted videos of them on Pornhub, but it was this, it's just a sort of yucky story that I thought, at some point I should look into it, but, not yet. And then, so finally I got around to it, and I was really struck by some of in particular, rape videos or torture videos that I saw. And whatever you think about porn in general, I think everybody agrees that there should not be rape videos of, 14-year-old girls posted on Pornhub so that a major internet company can monetize sexual assaults of underage girls, or in some cases, boys. That's when I decided to do my piece. I found, these kids who had been exploited in that way, who begged Pornhub to remove those videos, and Pornhub didn't. And if they had a lawyer, then okay, Pornhub would remove it. But and they just made it easy to download those videos so that they could be passed around person to person. And it just felt kind of monstrously unfair. We as a society were upset when Harvey Weinstein raped individuals, for example, Bill Cosby, this kind of sexual assault on a mass scale by a major company. And so that's how I ended up writing the piece. Pornhub then removed 10 million videos for which it had no consent. And then there have been a series of investigations. I also leaned on Canada. I said, Canada, Pornhub isn't Canada. Do you really want to be hosting a company that's inflicting rape videos on the world? And it seemed actually Canada wasn't so excited about that. And there were investigations. There is a class action lawsuit that is going to be going on trial in September. Criminal law, it's very hard to figure out how you write laws that cover things like porn and where the lines are. But if you allow lawsuits, then lawyers will look for clients. They will sue the companies, and the companies don't want to lose money. And so they will then police themselves. And I think that model of getting companies to police themselves so they don't lose lawsuits is actually not a bad one. And I hope we may be moving in that direction.
Do you think that indicates a trend? Like is this do you think it's a big enough deal in the porn industry that other producers, other companies, distributors and whatnot are looking at this and going, okay, we got to rethink our strategy? Do you think it's having that kind of impact?
I think that they're wondering a lot about that. Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act has protected internet companies from lawsuits historically. And now Section 230 is beginning. People are figuring out ways to get around it and to file these suits. And if, for example, in this trial in September, if the plaintiffs win, I think that Pornhub and other internet companies will decide, no, they don't want to lose, potentially vast sums of money to these plaintiffs, and they will be a lot more careful. And so, yeah, I think everybody's waiting to see to what extent Section 230, plaintiffs find ways around Section 230, and it's not going to 100% solve the problems. There are always going to be, some Russian internet company that figures out a place where nobody can sue it and will have stuff online. But, there are always going to be bank robberies as well. But we don't say, no point in banning bank robberies because there'll always be bank robberies. No, I mean, we can mitigate problems even if we can't entirely eliminate them.
No, that makes sense. I was so encouraged by the outcome of that positive outcome. And I appreciate your work. And I know there were so many others that were working on that as well. I just had a couple more questions. And one is, again, a more, and this will feel maybe a little bit like left field, but bear with me. One more slight overlap in our stories. I read in your bio that Desmond Tutu once dubbed you an honorary African for the way, your work was shedding light on suffering and struggle of so many people on the African continent. First part of the question, was that something he said to you directly? Or was it just an offhanded comment attributed to him? Do you know?
It was at a conference. We were on a panel together.
Okay.
And he was sort of teasing me, and he said, he called me an honorary African in this public event. It was also then broadcast on video.
That seems like high praise coming from someone like him.
Well, he's an amazing. I so honored him.
The reason it caught my eye is for years, I keep a secret list in my head. It's called my beer list. And it's a list of people that if I ever had the invitation and the opportunity, I'd drop everything and go sit with them and have a beer. Desmond Tutu's been on the top of my beer list for a long, until he passed away. Yeah. But who would be the first two people on your beer list? And you've obviously interacted with so many like world leaders, but are there people that if you could just sit and maybe it's not beer, cider, wine, whatever, like who would be on the top of your list?
I've had the opportunity to spend time with a lot of saints, including Desmond Tutu. I'd like to understand evil a little better, frankly. So I wouldn't mind sitting down with Vladimir Putin and trying to understand where that comes from, what he's done to dissidents, what he's done to Ukraine, et cetera.
Yeah.
Trying to understand the nature of evil and understanding it a little better, maybe understand better how to counter it.
That would probably have to be vodka then if it was.
Yeah, we produce cider on our farm, and I wouldn't want to bring him any of my cider.
No, it feels counterintuitive to just given the things that you and your wife as well have focused on in your careers, but your work conveys a lot of hope. Where does that come from for you?
It comes from two different places. One, the backdrop of my 40-odd years of reporting has been a stunning improvement in the human condition. And we don't tend to focus on it, but, one of the worst things that could happen to any person is to lose a child. When I was born, 1/5 of all kids died by the age of 5. When I graduated from college, it was down to 11%. Now we're down to 3%, setting a new low each year. The majority of humans had always been illiterate when I was a kid. Now we're pushing 90% adult literacy, in particular gains for women, in ways that just really change the world. And the other thing is that I've interviewed, lots of warlords and awful people, but side by side with the worst of humanity, you invariably encounter the very best. And in ways that just inspire me and remind me of the human potential to show incredible courage and strength. And so, for example, I was in rural Pakistan and met this incredible woman called Mukhtar Mai, who had been sentenced by her village council to be gang raped because of offense that her younger brother supposedly had committed. And then the village council carried out that sentence and they gang raped her. And the expectation was that she would then kill herself out of shame. And in fact, then she did not. And she prosecuted her attackers. She sent them to prison. And then she used compensation money for the rape to start the first school in her village because she believed that education was the best way to tackle the misogyny and cruelty that had attacked her. And then she enrolled the children of her attackers in her school. And you just can't be in that village. In that village, you see human evil, but you also see in Mukhtar this human capacity for strength and resilience and courage and decency and magnanimity. And that gives me hope. That's why I chase hope.
Wow. That's amazing. And that parallels so much the stories of like so many of survivors of trafficking I've gotten to know. I'm sure you've had similar conversations as well. It's so, it's counterintuitive. You don't expect it to show up in those places. That's awesome. Last question for you. I want to set it up just a little bit. This would be, I'm asking on behalf of myself and your two sons, do you have a question or a challenge or an encouragement for men today?
So it would be to show more empathy for women and girls who just by the accident of what chromosomes they end up with, end up so often being stigmatized and denied opportunities or targeted for harassment or rape or exploitation in innumerable ways. But I'd also, I must say, ask them and, my daughter while I'm at it, to show empathy also for those boys around the country and the world who've, been left behind in education, who are often, as a result, kind of poisoned and full of toxins in ways that damage them and damage women and girls around us. And I don't think we can build a healthy society unless we manage to feel empathy and develop better policies for boys and girls alike.
Yeah, that's so great. I really appreciate it. Nick, Kristof, your wisdom and tenacity is just a blessing. So thank you so much for joining us today.
Good to be with you, Tom.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you for listening to the Masculine Wilderness Podcast with your host, Tom Perez. This podcast is a production of Epic Project, a nonprofit organization dedicated to disrupting the demand for commercial sexual exploitation and dismantling the forces that perpetuate it. I'm your producer, Lauren Trantham. Special shout out to our favorite logo designer, Michelle Boucher, as well as Wes Finley, who crafted and donated our amazing theme song. Interested in sponsoring an episode? Send us an email at podcast@epicproject.org. That's podcast@epikproject.org. As a nonprofit organization, your donations allow us not only to produce this podcast and change the conversation around sexual exploitation, but also to manage our many programs, such as buyer intervention, teen prevention, and community education. Your support also allows us to support survivors of exploitation and more. To learn more about our work and to donate, visit www.epicproject.org. Once again, that is www.epikproject.org. Most importantly, this podcast would be nothing without you, the listener. Thank you for tuning in, subscribing, and sharing this episode with your friends and loved ones. Thank you for your commitment to learning more about the issues that affect our most vulnerable populations. Thank you for navigating this masculine wilderness with us. See you next episode.